It is great to have you this morning. We continue our study in the book of Ruth. We have seen, as we have gone through chapter 1, Ruth and Naomi encounter the crisis of death, the difficulty of travel, the awkwardness of being in a new place. All of that had landed at the front door of Ruth. As she has handled this, I'm sure there was a time where she just wanted some peace and quiet. She just wanted things to be settled down for just a moment. The problem doesn't have to go away, but I just need, I think the reference today in modern time is I need some me time. I need some me time. Well, Ruth didn't have that opportunity because, interestingly enough, in spite of the fact that she would want peace and quiet, there was something that had to happen. She had to eat. She had to live. She had to survive. And there was no men in her life, as the times dictated. The men supported the women. I know it's different today, and people get all, bent out of shape about that. That's just the way it was at that time. Ruth had to support herself and also her mother-in-law, Naomi. And so though she may have wanted a moment of peace and quiet away from the crisis, where she could just have her me time, that was not an option. Many of you have been in that spot before, I'm sure, where you didn't want to go to work, you didn't feel like it, you didn't like it, you didn't want to do any of those things, but you knew there were mouths that had to be fed, there were bills that had to be paid, you had to get up and you had to go to work, and Ruth was in that exact same situation. We pick up our story in chapter 2 of Ruth, page 183, if you are using the Pew Bible. We'll read just the first 7 verses, though we are going to go through most of the chapter, all of the chapter this morning. Now, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech. Remember, that was Naomi's husband, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." She went out, entered the field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Now, what is happening, and we'll talk about this in the future, is the harvesters are going through, and they did not have John Deeres or anything like that. They would go through and they would cut, and then they would pick up, and they would pack into these big, they call them the sheaves, and these big bundles, barley, wheat, and then somebody would come up behind them and pick up. The gleaning is they are picking up the leftovers. They are going through, and they are picking up the little bits of barley and wheat and those things that did not get harvested. That's what Ruth is doing. She may have wanted some peace and quiet, but the demands of life and her circumstance required that she go and pick up and glean. Just then, verse 4, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvest, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came from Moab with Naomi." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. As we go through chapter 2, there are a few things that we are going to see, and I think are important to point out in this account of Ruth. The first thing that we see, and we saw it here in these first couple verses, is the initiative of Ruth. The initiative of Ruth. Now, she went to work. Now, she did not have an option, really. If she wanted to eat, And she wanted to have Naomi have food. She did not have any husband or, as we will find out, a guardian redeemer, a kinsman redeemer. None of that existed. There was no place where she could go and get food and bring it. She had to go and do the thing that required, and that requires initiative. Initiative is something, almost seems like at times that's become a bad word nowadays, unfortunately. Initiative. People waiting instead of going out and doing. Ruth had all the excuses that you could possibly have wanted. She was in a new place, didn't know anybody. Her husband had died, her father-in-law had died, and she just could have stacked them up. It was a long trip, I'm tired, and all those things. But she didn't. If you'll notice, that last part of the passage of Scripture that we read says, she has remained here from the morning till now, except for a short break. So it wasn't like she got up at 10, the crack of noon to go do some work. She got up early, went to work, and stayed there. There's that initiative on the part of Ruth. I want you also to note how, as the story progresses, that she's not there demanding that someone give her vice president of, harvesters. She's like, well, I'm here, and Naomi's hungry, and I'm hungry, and so I'll just start here, and I'll just pick up this piece of grain and that piece of grain. There's initiative. We do well to remember that in our own lives, particularly when we're not talking about just business and those kinds of things. When we're talking about our spiritual walk with the Lord. I don't feel like I hear from the Lord anymore. Well, have you talked to the Lord? Have you prayed? Have you read the Bible? Have you been around God's people? Well, no. Perhaps what you need to do is take a little more initiative in your walk with the Lord. You need to have the same mindset that Ruth had here as she was trying to feed herself and Naomi. So the first thing we see is the initiative of Ruth. That's important. But it goes on in verse 8. So Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. Goes on, verse 14. He says, at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come over here. Come have bread and dip it in the wine vinegar. When he sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. That's probably something she had not had in a very long time, was a leftover. Some of you don't like to eat leftovers, and I probably, depends on the leftover, right? She had leftover. As she got up to glean, she's going back to work there in verse 15. Boaz gave orders to his men, let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand. And so Boaz is saying, come and eat with me. Who are you? Come eat with me. Stay in my field. That was important because Ruth really was in a vulnerable situation. As a woman without any men around to help provide and protect, Boaz was saying, no, you come and stay in my fields. Then he invites her to dinner. And we see this invitation on Boaz, not only to come and, I say dinner, lunch, however you want to call it. And then he says to those who are harvesting, let her gather among the sheaves. In other words, I don't want you to have her go and pick up the leftovers. I want her to be able to go to piles and just pull out from the piles, the sheaves. So we have the initiative of Ruth that is met by the invitation of Boaz here in this passage. I love the fact that Boaz seems to be a man of high character. Notice, did you see how he came to the field? The Lord bless you. Lord bless you. Who's that? What is she doing in my field? In order to know that that was somebody different, you can only assume that he knew everybody else that was in the field. to know the one that was not, so to speak, belonging, that was there. Stay in my field. Recognized how vulnerable Ruth was. Invited her, come eat with us, go get the grain that you need. You don't have to pick it off the ground. You can take it out of the sheaves that are there. So Ruth, verse 17, gleaned the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah, which we find out is about 30 pounds or so of grain. I don't know if she sat out that day, but her initiative, which woke her up in the morning, was encountered by the invitation of Boaz, who saw her hard work. Said, come and eat lunch here. Take from the sheaves. She goes home with leftovers and 30 pounds. So why was that? Well, that was something that she could sell. It was a way of gaining income that she desperately would need. So this chapter has begun with the initiative of Ruth. It encounters the invitation of Boaz. And then it is met, all of this is surrounded, if you will, by the instruction of God. We saw that briefly in verse 3. She went out and entered the field and began to glean behind the harvesters. This was something that was established as a way to provide for those who did not have anything. And so the harvesters, the field owners would hire the harvesters, and they would come along, and all that was left over. And we will see in just a moment that the instructions were given for the harvesters to leave the edges so that those that didn't have any, with the proper initiative, could come along and begin to provide for themselves. This was established by God long ago, verse 20. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. As it turned out, I don't think in verse 3 that it was just a coincidence that Ruth ended up in the field of Boaz. This whole thing God has been working in and through it. The instruction of God that said, leave the edges of the field, all of that came along, the field that Ruth just happened to end up on. There are some things that are coincidental, but we can also understand and recognize that God moves through the choices and decision. He says, I make all things work together for good. He doesn't say all things are good, but he can take those awful, terrible things and he begin to bend them, and so that there can be good that can come out of that. And we certainly begin to see this in the life of Ruth. Her initiative is met by the invitation of Boaz. And because God had instructed long ago a means to provide for those who did not have, this is all coming together for Ruth. A lot of times we see the hand of God moving and working in our lives, but we kind of see it in the rearview mirror. Are we right? Because at the time, if we recognize it as the hand of God, we would be all for it, right? We wouldn't be sitting in the car, why, God, why are you doing this? We would be sitting there instead going, woohoo! I can't wait. Because we knew that God was going to take care of all of this. Ruth, with her own initiative, is met by the invitation of God, surrounded by the instruction of God. Leave the edges. Provide for those who don't have any. Allow them an opportunity to provide for themselves, to take care of them. The NIV translation, which you have, calls that person a guardian redeemer. Let me read it. She added, this man, verse 20 again, is our close relative, and he is one of our guardian redeemers. One of the other translations call it a kinsman redeemer. Now, a guardian redeemer was instructed, this is the instruction from long ago, did a couple things. The first thing was it was to provide an heir for a brother who had died. We certainly know that was happening. And so we didn't want the family line to die, and that was instructed in Deuteronomy chapter 25. The second thing it did was it provided a way to redeem the land that belonged to the family that was sold off. So they had a means to go back and buy that land, to redeem it, because that is what it means. A guardian redeemer, a kinsman redeemer, is one who buys back. It is Gael in the Hebrew, redeemer. One who pays the price, what is due, the one who clears the debt, provides for an heir, goes back and redeems, buys the land back that was sold outside of the family. A kinsman redeemer, guardian redeemer, also would redeem a relative who was sold into slavery. A thing that would happen. Say, oh, you think of that. Oh, they were kept. No, they would, as a means of paying for a debt, they would sell themselves into slavery. And so they would come along and they would have this debt. You owe me all this money for this thing, whatever it was. So I will serve you. And that's the way that would work. The kinsman redeemer, the guardian redeemer, would come along and be able to pay the debt that was paid so that individual could come out of slavery. Lastly, the kinsman redeemer would be the one responsible for avenging someone who had murdered someone. We see that there in Numbers. And so this was some instruction that God had established long ago that had now come full circle for Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. And here we are in the field of barley, and all that this is happening here, well, it had roots long ago. Have you ever thought you were the first one to think of something, and then you go quickly and look it up, on your phone or computer, and you find out that it was invented in 1839? Or I've heard writers, artists, songwriters, and all, I have this super duper original tune. They sit down at the piano and the guitar, dun, 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 they pick it out, and they say, hey, hon, listen to this. Dun, 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 dun. Oh, yeah, that sounds just like the song Johnny Cash sang, 4 or 5 years ago. Oh, okay. Well, I was just checking. Yeah, that's all I was doing. A lot of times we think we're the one being original, and the truth of the matter is God has been behind the scenes, and He is orchestrating things in our lives. We read the passage, you heard it read by Wayne. What can separate us from the love of God? And essentially, Paul answers the question. He says, nothing. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. The instruction of God, established long ago, surrounds us, those who have called themselves believers, followers of Christ. And when we live in that instruction, God works through those opportunities, those things that we think are just coincidence, original thoughts to us, and it turns out God was moving, if you will, His finger all along the whole time. This chapter, we see the initiative of Ruth as she wakes up early to go and glean, to pick up the leftovers in the field. We also see the invitation of Boaz. He recognizes that hard work. He recognizes that this is someone new. He recognizes someone's in a vulnerable position, and a man of integrity and character says, you stay in this field, here are the leftovers, and you can pull from the stacks. The instruction of God is surrounding all of this. And as the guardian redeemer, the kinsman redeemer is there, Boaz, showing up. The clear connection between Boaz, the guardian, and Jesus, the eternal redeemer, is there. Can you not see the connection? We use the word redeem, to buy back. What Boaz, and we'll talk about this in a moment, was for Ruth. We can see a picture of that in Jesus Christ. Boaz is redeeming Ruth, and it is a foreshadowing of what is to come for us in the complete work of Jesus Christ. It's called theologians call it a type. Boaz is a type. We see that fulfilled in the person and work of Jesus Christ. But we're not done. We've had those three things. We have one more. We have one more, and we find it in verse 19. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice on you." She walks in with the leftover food, 30 pounds of barley. He said, Where'd you get this? I remember one time, our neighbor across the street when we lived up north, we took, it was Halloween. And in the small towns, you know how it is. We pick the day of Halloween. It doesn't have to actually be on the Halloween. It's one of my favorite things in the world. You tell that to other people, and they're like, you do what? Oh, yeah, we change Halloween all the time. And so on this particular Halloween, Tyler was young, second grade, whatever it was, and Michelle could not be at the house, and I needed to be on the house because where we lived that was the main drag. That's where all the people were going to be. So we needed someone to pass out candy. So our neighbor across the street said, don't worry, I'll take Tyler. So Tyler dressed up like, I don't know, Batman or something like that. Maybe Spider-Man, some man. And so he dressed up and came and got him. Daryl came and got him across the street. He goes, okay, come on. Now Daryl, turns out, they didn't have any children of their own. And so Daryl, turns out, was a huge fan of Halloween. And so he came with his mask and all of that, and the two of them took off. I didn't see them. And finally, it starts to get dark, and the Halloween time has come to an end, and all of that, and they pull into the door. They come in the back door, and Tyler has a bag that he took, and it is completely, full. And Daryl is carrying another bag, and he has more candy in it. I will never forget the words that I heard. Tyler walks in the back door, bag full of candy. Mr. Hollenchock knows everybody. It's kind of what happens here. Naomi looks and sees all that Ruth has. Says, whose field have you been in? Where'd you get all this? Goes on. I have worked today, field of Boaz. The Lord bless it. Naomi said to the daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. She added, that man is our close relative. He is our guardian redeemer. Then Ruth, the Moabite, said, he even said to me, stay with me, with my workers until I finish harvesting my grain. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. Clearly, she was vulnerable. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvest were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. I want you to notice something that maybe you saw in chapter 1, the attitude change in Naomi. In chapter 1, Naomi was depressed. But by chapter 2, the very thought of redemption energizes, awakens Naomi. In chapter 1, woe is me. We can read it. We can look and see. Don't call me Naomi, verse 20 of chapter 1. Call me Mara, because the Lord Almighty has made my life bitter. And now we get over to verse 20. She sees a pile of barley. Who knew that's all it took was a pile of barley? She gets over there. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. The very thought of redemption awakened Naomi. We had the initiative of Ruth, met by the invitation of Boaz. Surrounded by the instruction of God that was established long ago. And this concept, this idea of redemption, energized Naomi. She went from, it is all God's fault, to I can't believe God bless him, bless us all. In that, the very thought of redemption brought hope to a hopeless situation. What we see here is what Boaz was for Ruth and Naomi, the guardian redeemer, the kinsman redeemer. Jesus is for us a redeemer to all who believe. We should, number one, if we're followers of Christ, be excited about our own redemption and what it means for us. All that we sang about this morning, about going to the other side, a mansion, all of that is possible because of the redemption that has happened for us through the work of Jesus Christ. What Boaz is in providing for Ruth, Jesus is for us in providing for our salvation. We could not on our own, but Jesus could. If you look at Romans chapter 3, you see why this is so important. Chapter 3, verse 21. But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. This righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. There is no difference between Jew and Gentile, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And all are justified freely by His grace through here's our word, the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. The buying back happened to all, didn't matter if they were Jew or Gentile. The type that was Boaz and Ruth found fulfillment, although it was foreshadowed in the person and work of Jesus Christ. And how Naomi was awakened, how she went from blaming God to blessing God. How she went from zero hope, despair, and depression. She now goes full of hope. She's now in a place where she's not, oh, forget it, we're all just going to die. Now she's saying, hey, Naomi, you stay over there in that field. So there's a couple things that we take with us out of this. Number one, have you been redeemed? Have you been redeemed? Have you been saved? Have you received Christ as your Savior? That's the first question. Because all that we sang about, all those promises that were touched on in the music, those do not belong to you unless you have received Jesus Christ. Say, well, that's awful mean. I'm not the one who set the, established how things go. We read in Romans chapter 3, verse, that all have sinned. That's me, that's you, that's all of us. All have sinned. Because of that sin, all the blessings and promises of God are away from us. But because we can be redeemed by Jesus Christ, those promises can become ours. We become heirs of God. The first question you need to answer is, are you redeemed? Now, if the answer to that question is yes, if that is the case, I want you this morning to do something just a little bit different. Rather than thinking of yourself, I want you to think how exciting redemption was to Naomi, how it reawakened, how it reinvigorated her. You ever take a cold shower? I know what you're thinking. No, are you a crazy person? No, who would do that? You take the cold, sometimes you don't get a choice, right? And you take a cold shower, and man, when that water hits you, I mean, what is it? Woo! I mean, you might say something different. I'm not going to ask, but I'm just saying it might happen. But boy, you're awake after that, aren't you? This morning, rather than thinking of yourself, if you are one who is redeemed, who can answer yes to the question, I'm saved. I've received the gift that God has brought to me. I want you this morning to think of someone that you encounter every day in your life who desperately needs to be bought back by Jesus Christ, who needs to experience the redemption of Jesus in their life. They could be the person across the street. They could be the person behind you that every Saturday night turns it up. And you know what's going on in their backyard. Who is it? Just one. One person that needs to know and experience the redemption of Jesus Christ. If you've been redeemed, can what we reawaken in you today be a passion and an enthusiasm for the gospel of Jesus Christ? There is neither Jew nor Gentile. That means the door is open to all who would believe. Even that guy who drives you crazy down the street. And I would say, especially that guy who drives you crazy down the street. Who needs to experience the redemption of Jesus Christ? Have you been redeemed? Who needs to experience that redemption in your life that you encounter every day? Allow the possibility, the opportunity, the reality of redemption of Jesus Christ that has saved you to reawaken your passion for sharing the gospel. We saw the initiative of Ruth, the invitation of Boaz, surrounded by the instruction of God, and finally we end up with the information of Naomi, who tells us all about that, who is the guardian redeemer, and all those things. And you see an enthusiasm and a passion in Naomi that just one chapter previously was dead. Let's be enthusiastic about our own redemption and about the redemption of those that are around us. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we come this morning. We ask your blessings on this time. Seal through your Spirit what it is we have heard and read. And I pray if there's someone here today that has not been redeemed, has not been saved, has not asked for you to forgive them of their sins, that, Father, today would be their day of salvation, that redemption would come to their home. And Lord, I pray that those of us who have been redeemed, that the person that we're thinking of right now, that they would come to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. That we would be as enthusiastic about our redemption, so enthusiastic that we cannot help but share it and live it each and every day. Reawaken in us an excitement and a passion for the redemption we have received. And help us not be those who hoard that redemption. Father, may we be a generous, redeemed people. In Jesus Christ we pray. Amen. This morning, the invitation is simple. One, if you've never experienced and asked Jesus Christ to save you, that's the first thing you need to do. That's the first thing you need to do. There are a couple ways we can do that. I can visit with you, and you can let me know, hey, I need to talk to you. On your bulletin is a little taro sheet. Drop that in a moment. Our ushers are going to come and get that. You can just see me after church and say, I need to visit with you. I want to share with you not what Gerald thinks about salvation and redemption, but what God thinks about salvation and redemption. If you've got a question about that, if you've got an inkling, if you have even some doubts, don't wait. Don't wait. Ushers, you come this morning.